Calling all pitchers and pitching coaches, PitchDoc 2024 is your destination for revolutionary pitching education and information, from the newest technology to advances in biomechanics knowledge to take-home strategies and application for making your pitchers better today. Join us August 8th and 9th at the Westin O'Hare in Chicago. Experience transformative sessions led by leaders from the college game to technology companies to player development experts. Use promo code OGXPodcast to take an extra 10% off. Visit go.ogxsoftball.com/pitchdoc. Again, visit go.ogxsoftball.com/pitchdoc and use code OGXPodcast to take an additional 10% off. Spots are limited, so secure yours today. All right, we are back for another episode with Ashley back in business this week and Laura and Ashley together. So we'll see how this goes. We're testing our, tech capabilities at this point. So hopefully all.
And we're also testing my hand flailing control while talking because Laura and I are quite close, and so that seems great until my hands start going. So I am going to be
and physically, but
a little more conscious of that than usual.
Probably not a future job of yours is to be a TV announcer, because you just karate chop the person you're announcing with and probably say things you shouldn't say on TV.
Yeah, so right, that too. But Laura, good luck. Okay, here we go.
All right. The first topic we're going to kind of kick off. So Laura and I talked about this a little bit. We were live in some of the conference tournaments last week. I think Laura and I both had it on the TV in the background while we were recording. And so now we're about one day away from kicking off regionals at the Division I level. Today, I believe, starts regionals at the Division II and Division III level. I saw some, my alma mater starts today. They're hosting for the first time ever. Woo woo. Go Bears.
Nice.
And so everyone is kicking, but we'll kind of focus a little bit of our attention on Division I and some sort of takeaways of what we are looking forward to going into it, what some surprises were. I'm going to start because my brain has been on this I'm always about the fan digestibility of things. In order for a sport to be really popular, I think it's important that the fans can digest things that are happening. So an example of this, when we talked about the leaving early rule, was that it's a hard thing for fans to digest. I would say the way we do rankings is really hard for fans to digest, because I think there's a lot of argument that the regionals were appropriately assigned based on factors that they take into consideration, like strength of schedule and ranked wins and things like that. But it doesn't match the rankings that the fans see. And even still, after the regionals were announced, then the rankings got released in these multiple channels, NCAA, who all the different people that do the rankings, and they don't match the regional allotment. And I was thinking about it, football. You could argue, obviously people were very upset this year that Florida State didn't get in the top 4 in football, but it matched the people who do the rankings and the people who assign the tournament are the same. So they match for the fan. So I don't know. I'm just curious of your thoughts. And I guess maybe I don't know enough about the intricacies of the differences between the committees and things like that. But I would just argue that the visible ranking should probably match the ultimate regional allotments, because that is very confusing to me. And I'm a more educated fan than the, casual watcher of softball. So curious your guys' thoughts on that.
I think there were a lot of places where, avid fans of particular teams absolutely saw disappointment, we were Duke, what the heck, where was that seating? But then when you go and look at all the factors that go in of strength of schedule, and, we're learning that Q1 wins versus Q4 wins, those were terms, as you said, I think we're above average fans. And I had never heard those terms before. So I think even for, people who follow the game as closely as we do, it's what is the criteria? Why doesn't that always match? And then that, you're absolutely right. It makes that more difficult for, maybe more, maybe not casual fans, maybe less analytical fans, but it's difficult. It's difficult to feel like you can feel encouraged about the postseason when what you're seeing from a ranking standpoint in the regionals, they don't match up. It's not clear all the time of that. But some of the discussion, I think, that's been happening on social media, it's helped to talk about like, you know, Duke's ranking does make sense when you look at these factors, but it's the fact that like these factors aren't always known and clear and transparent, make it really hard to be okay with how those regionals got
right.
out.
Well, and also why don't those, I guess, to my point from like a fan standpoint, why aren't those the same factors that determine the rankings throughout the season? That's what I don't get. So
Totally.
it's definitely complicated to say like, okay, Duke's been ranked 2, 3, 4 all season, and then they get this, you know, X seeding at regional, or, you know, Texas A&M has been ranked X all season, and then they get this regional. I think like that is confusing. And even literally the day after regionals were announced, the rankings came out, and Duke was still ranked, you know, whatever, 4th or 5th, I can't remember. But like that's confusing to me. Why aren't why aren't the people doing those two things? At least for, you can always have other ranking sites, I guess. So you could always have, you know, D1 softball can rank things however they want. That's not, but you know, the NCAA or whoever ultimately, you know, this committee, why aren't those things the same? You know, so it's like when you watch the football selection show, what you were watching was the release of the rankings, you know, like where did the ranking shift? So it was like everyone all season, you know, Michigan, my husband's a Michigan fan, so we were obviously watching that, but like was trying to be ranked number 1, and that held for what that meant for postseason. You know, that kind of confuses me of the way that we do it. And I don't know how other sports outside of football, I guess, is a little more visible, but do this. But I think the fact that those two things aren't the same for us is just really interesting and confusing as a fan. And I imagine confusing as a coach, like of what you're going for.
I was going to chime in with, I agree. Like, why can't we just know the criteria? Like, this is just like the standard criteria. And then also some of the criteria are like, I don't know, kind of jacked if you ask me, because like in our sport where you are traveling every Thursday and then you play Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and you get back and you have to travel the next Thursday, they're like non-conference strength of schedule. How you supposed to like tuck in? Imagine if Duke was like, if they told Marissa before the season, like, hey, this is essentially like where you need to, you know, this is where what's going to sort of like determine this or that for you. So it's like, imagine the difference for those athletes in their schedule if they have to just get like hammered in a midweek. I think that midweeks are already like too much in our game. It's just like crazy. Think about next year when like UCLA is flying across the country to be in a Big Ten. And then what? They're supposed to come back on Sunday, Monday after that exhausting trip and then just constantly turn around for a midweek. I already think midweeks are kind of crazy. And if anything, to me, the purpose of midweeks are supposed to be to basically like play a tier below, essentially.
Give
if you're
that
in a really
tier opportunities to play at your stadium, to have some visibility, like that type of thing too.
Yeah, and to give, maybe there are certain pitchers who are like, you know, battling it out or trying to get other athletes or trying to get in the lineup. Like this is the time. And so now this criteria of like non-conference, I almost feel like, well, what the hell? Like it almost feels like impossible. Like you're supposed to just get crushed 4 days a week.
I remember when we were at Mississippi State, I remember Sam Ricketts talking about like it was going to be challenging for them to find teams to play them midweek. It's not easy to get to Starkville.
Also because of where they're located.
Yeah, it's not easy to get to Starkville. And so she's like, if I want to have some, competitive midweeks, like it requires additional travel. And when you're playing in the SEC and you're traveling the way you are already on the weekend for a 3-game series, it adds such a level of complexity to recovery, injury management, performance management that to what end? Like, I think that's my question.
Who is the pitching for that? Like, at least I assume baseball mirrors that, like NCAA baseball, but like you're not having the same guy throw on Friday, Sunday, and Wednesday. So,
well, I think this conversation definitely sort of the outside of conference schedule is something that spans all the sports, right? Because this is the exact conversation that happened in football, which is Florida State they had lost no games. And, but, so what was ultimately said by the committee is that ACC is valued less, that was clear. So I definitely think that conversation that's going to exist forever. The Big Ten, like a Michigan wins the Big Ten and their Northwestern was atop the Big Ten until a tournament, and they are not hosting, they're not ranked. So, there's a little bit of that's probably always going to be true, I think, where it's like, you know, you say without saying that, you know, ACC is lesser than the SEC. It's value because of the teams in it or whatever. And I think there's certainly place to argue that, you know, whether you agree or disagree with that, I think is a place for that. It's definitely tough, you know, as you're saying. Then if you go by outside of conference, you're probably not going to be able to really do that. And so ultimately, I think it's very clear from a Duke standpoint that if I'm an ACC school, even if I do all of these things, here's where I'm going to be ranked in the criteria, which I guess, you know, and we can argue about that. And so I think there's a level of like disagree, agree at the bottom of the, like, at the end of the day, though, like, let's just make it very clear from the beginning. Like, they should have, nothing changed. They should have been ranked that then all season. It's just like, this is how it is. You know, you can't, unless you somehow find a way to go play the SEC midweek or something, you know, whatever they ultimately, then you could be atop the ACC and do this the whole time, and this will be your ranking. You know, you will be 10. You will be.
It's why, like,
as high as you can get.
When these rankings come out, it always feels so subjective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, surely it's not, right? It's not like people are just like throwing in what they feel like doing. They had some criteria, but like, yes, this idea of like, why wouldn't that just all be, you know, out there? Just so that people know, like, you may not even agree with the criteria. What I'm saying is like, I think the criteria doesn't really match what the game is, but that's one conversation. But then there's another of like, at least there is criteria. So whether you agree with it or not, there are criteria. And then that's what it is. And everybody knows it, and end of story. But instead, because it's not that clear, everyone thinks it's like, it's political. It's about TV ratings. It's about all this, which like surely is not real, but you can understand why people would think that.
Right. Yeah.
And it goes back to the casual fan conversation, not casual fan. That seems
right. But more,
it goes back to the fan conversation though, of like, it makes them then not understand. And then if you feel frustrated that this team you follow so passionately gets screwed in the off season, your willingness to maybe even watch them in the postseason goes down. It's like, you want people to know exactly where their teams sit because they are so attached to them, you know, and you want that to be consistent because you want them to pull for that team. If you feel like your team's gotten just, you know, jacked over in the postseason, I think your enthusiasm
even
goes
knowing
down
like the order of the criteria, because it's like, think about like travel ball where, you know, like if it's a tie or something, you know, like it'll be this and then it'll go to this and then it'll go to this, you know. And I was thinking like, that's what seemed confusing about the like Alabama, Texas A&M. It's like A&M took 2 games from Alabama in Tuscaloosa, but got ranked below them because they're like, well, because when it came to common opponents, you know, but it's like, oh, well, who knew that? Why is that above head to head? Is it? I guess, right? Or it's like they both get weighed in. I don't know.
Conference record.
Well, and again, A&M record 10th in the ranking 2 days after the regional. So
it's confusing.
It's like, why can't those match? I don't get it.
Yeah.
Like, why don't those match? I don't like. Why can't Committee be the person doing the rankings weekly?
I think it's what sets this time of year up for disappointment. You know, it's like you don't know. It's not transparent. It's not clear. It's not the same people making those decisions between rankings and the seedings for the tournament. And it's confusing. Like, again, I just go back to Duke because it was the most obvious example. Just like, I'm like waiting for their name to get called. And I'm like, what the heck?
So were they.
So were they, right.
On a related but kind of separate note, as much as I love like the Penn State, like these athletes just feel like they won the freaking lottery. Yeah, like, I mean, seriously, they did. So like, I could watch that 3 million times in a row and cry every time.
Every time it's popped up in my algorithm on no matter what platform it was, I'm like, I'm watching this.
Totally.
I'm watching their reaction to getting the
I also
the fact that they were second to last, it was so good too.
So good. I also love when people are just pissed, you know, because then I'm like, ooh. Was it last year that Texas, or was it 2 years ago?
Washington.
I can't remember.
Last year was Texas. Last year was Texas. 2 years
they
ago
just showed them, and it was just like
Washington. Washington walked out.
Oh, they
2 years ago.
Walked out.
2 years ago.
Yes.
Walked out, yeah.
And I'm like, I'm also here for things like that. I'm like, yes, stir the pot. Everyone's pissed, right? Because I'm like no one wants postseason to be nice. You want to think of like the idea of teams coming into postseasons just like ready to kill. I love it. Obviously, you know, that's like. But I'm like, man, this is like really stirring the pot, man, for postseason. I'm in for it. So on related but separate note, I do love, I don't think there should be teams sitting there like that disappointed for the reasons we're talking about, but when you see the reaction so pissed, I'm like, oh, they're gonna start off on fire.
I think I sent this to you guys in our group text of like these schools that are posting their resumes, right? So they're preparing these social media posts at the end of the season of like NCAA committee for your consideration. It's like they shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't have to do
We're really good Samaritans off the field.
You know, I saw it from was Texas Tech, and rightly so, because they were a bubble team, right? They were right on that bubble, and so it's like they shouldn't have to do that. Like they shouldn't have to put together their playing resumes, their records, stats. If everything is clear and transparent, it all speaks for itself. In what world are we saying, could you write a cover letter, please, for your inclusion into the NCAA tournament? Like that's confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting. So, all right. Well, more to come. I'm sure next week we'll be talking about regional, what happens in the regionals. So I think I'm pretty confident we're going to have some upsets. So that would be fun.
I'm here for the upsets, man.
Is mayhem trademarked? Mayhem?
Yeah.
Trademarked?
I'm sure, Lauren. Sure you were looking to do it yourself. I don't think you got that one.
I didn't want to get in trouble for the trademark.
Okay. Just gonna go out on a whim with that. I like, unless it's a team that obviously I'm really leaning in and like supporting, we work with, we got connections with, I'm always here for the upset.
Totally.
So I hope we've got a couple next week.
100%.
Yeah. That'll be fun. All right. Next one is, we are in this time frame, obviously, that the majority of the country has spring softball. Not everyone, but the majority. Spring high school softball, I should say. And so we're in this time frame where high school season's starting to wrap up. And we have this transition period between high school season and travel ball season. What we tend to see, obviously, is that in a variety of ways, so maybe we can get into this just a little bit, that our athletes come back having regressed all the way to, more severe things, or in pain, or, there's a variety of things. Best case scenario is that they were able to keep up with some level of training and they've maintained, which we do have athletes that are doing. But I think a conversation that has come up that I'm curious of talking about is, what do I do in this time period before my high school, as my high school season is wrapping, before my travel ball season kicks off, if I have time. So not everyone has time. What am I doing to kind of like try to restore some baseline, or how much do we feel like people should be like chasing, getting, back to some level of something? Like how do I focus my energy at this time frame? So maybe I'll start with you, Ash, from a pitching standpoint, and then kind of weigh in on a hitting standpoint, I guess.
I think it depends on the regression, first and foremost. It's all going to be relatively similar, but it depends on the regression. So we're very rarely seeing that athletes are completely unchanged. They're not better. So that's for sure.
Maintaining is all you can hope for.
Yeah. So like, I think we've talked about this concept on so many platforms. You don't just play a high school season and have 4 games a week and pitch them all and whatever and come back better. So if they've maintained, great. Those are rare circumstances. So if the regressions are down to like pain, then, it's a different conversation. And this happens a lot in pitching. It's just like it's not just like, oh, I'm sore the day after I throw, there's pain. That one's tougher, because the reality is, if, even though it's a short summer, it's usually about 6 to 8 weeks, depending on, who you're playing for, where your nationals are. You can't sustain 6 to 8 weeks if you're starting in pain. So if you are coming into that in pain, you have to really start making, I think, choices and decisions for like what you're prioritizing. So let's say, for example, like Colorado is, something that's like, that's really Colorado on is what needs to be. Then you need to have some workload management to really see if you can like put out the fire. That might not be ideal, but the reality is, if you just ignore that pain and keep throwing, then likely you're just going to keep seeing things go down. And then obviously, we're talking about young athletes. This is just never what we would be advising. Ignore the pain, keep throwing through it. So that's one scenario where that significantly, in my opinion, alters the summer, which is why it's important to get ahead of those things. These are not, as we've talked about many times, the pain situations that we're not talking of like, oh, I slid into second base and such happened, or there was a collision. We're talking about the chronic build of this pain. When we're not talking about pain and we're just talking about someone's velocity is down, that's another tier. Usually there's not enough time for it to return. So it can with a little bit of rest, but usually the amount of rest you actually have, and let's be clear, the travel ball season is not exactly like, it's a little bit more manageable than the high school season because it's literally not 6 days a week while you're in school, but it's not manageable. I mean, you're flying all over the country. You're sleeping in, hotel rooms all the time. And you're playing an amount of games that's just not actually feasible. So it's rare. Sometimes someone can go up about a half a tier in velocity, but it's really not common. So if you're coming in and you're like, okay, I was throwing 62 and now I'm like 56, 57, I think for that athlete to be able to throw probably, go up another 2 miles per hour, maybe 3 would be a real success. So that's a kind of a hybrid tier, I would say, of like sometimes it ain't gonna happen. The other one is if break regresses. And I think that's one of like, if velo seems okay and pain is in a good spot, but your break has regressed, that one's sort of like the simplest one because essentially what we're seeing when we're talking about fatigue, it's not just like you need to sleep more. It's that you've been just throwing at high intensity way too much. And the trunk contributions have basically regressed and now the arm is rigid or the arm is lost its art form. So it's kind of a simple equation. You get back in, you start throwing your plyos more, you start throwing more weight variability, you're throwing at more low to moderate intensity, and you'd be shocked with like how fast this art form can really come back to life. And so that's sort of the simplest one. And so if what you can hope for is that if I'm going to regress it all, it's going to be like, we're going to see a lack, regressions in stability, some regressions in power, usually like all this stuff is just sort of like a given. But when we're getting, is it making its way out to performance and or health? I would say the best case scenario is if it's only like my break profile has regressed. To me, that's a super simple one. If you just keep riding with high intensity work, then it won't come back in our experience. It's got to be attached to this. Get back into strength and conditioning. Get that trunk to contribute more. Start throwing at more low to moderate intensity between games. Use your plyos. Use your weighted balls. The staple training systems, essentially, and protocols that we use here at OGX. And that's, I think, when we're having athletes and they're checking back in and that's the scenario they're in, I'm like, we got you. Don't worry about it. We just need probably like 2 weeks and you're going to feel more like yourself.
Yeah. I would say one of the things we haven't really talked about, because a lot of it has been about, when we've talked on this topic, a lot of it has been about just the high school season being a little unmanageable and the workload is so high. And, what I've seen this year probably more as we have athletes who are a little more like knowledgeable with our systems and a little more self-aware about themselves, what's good, what it looks like when it gets bad for them, that type of thing, is that they, one of the things the high school season doesn't do in a way that preps them well for the travel ball season, in addition to just being too much workload, is expose some of these regressions, right? So if I regress in break, or from a hitting standpoint, if I regress in posture, which will then expose me to a backspin pitch or will expose me on velo, I don't face that level of pitcher enough, or I don't face the level of hitter that I'm going to see in summer enough to maybe realize that that's happening, realize this like first tier of thing that's happening. And so it sort of just keeps trickling until you start to get into, when you're talking about pitching, that my velo's down, that my, I don't sort of like tack it fast enough because I don't see that. The thing I will say from a positive standpoint that I've seen a lot different from our hitters this year that have been able to keep up in some levels, not like they're so consistent all the time, but they're able to keep up with the communication with us, that they're looking at video a lot, is this understanding of themselves and an understanding when things are unraveling, even when performance at that level is not catastrophically, going down. That like I faced a mediocre pitcher and I wasn't on it I didn't have as much like power off the bat, or I wasn't on it in the way that me at my best would be. So yes, I had still good performance, but I need to come in and work on X, or I want to check this, or this is the adjustment I'm going to make, or things like that. So from a positive standpoint, I think one way that some of our players have been able to avoid kind of that degree, hopefully, is just this understanding of themselves and what it looks like to start derailing way faster than when we get to this level, and to kind of, okay, I need to go low intensity this week, or I need to come in and do X, or I need to really focus on my first move, or things like that, to kind of manage this. So I think kudos to some of our athletes that have been able to do that. And hopefully that sets them up, maybe not to be on the up, but to set up for this transition to be smoother. But I definitely agree with you. I think for the most part, in my experience, because a lot of when I go to travel ball, my team, a lot of them do our training, obviously. That for the most part, knock on wood, what we've seen is these players are a little more knowledgeable. They're a little more mindful of what their workload should look like in high school season. They have communications. And so for the most part, last summer, what I saw from my pitchers is that they lost break. And we were able to we knew that day one, if they weren't regularly being assessed already, then we got on Repsodo. We saw what was gone. We adjusted our pitch calling based off of it, but we worked really hard to, by Colorado, kind of what you're saying, by these bigger tournaments to get it back. And we were able to. And they, they were able to be, for the most part, on the upswing at the end of the summer. But I definitely think it's trickier when you get to the point where you are, obviously, if you're having pain or you've totally regressed on that, it's tough. This transition's tough, and you got to have some hard conversations, I think, about what the first few weeks look like, and just kind of know that you prioritized high school, and that's okay if that's what you wanted to do. But
we had a coach in here, one of our OGX coaches, say oh man, it's so frustrating. We had an athlete who was new this year. So this is the first time. And I do feel like that's a difference. Our returning athletes year after year, they know how to handle high school a little bit differently. It's just kind of, the way it goes. And so he's like, oh, it's so frustrating. If she would have just, she hasn't thrown plyos in 2 months. If she would have just used plyos, if she would have just made sure that she did more low intensity. And so I could sense his frustration. And I thought she will next time. She's an underclassman. Yeah. So she will next year because basically, she's now because, halfway through the high school season, she was having so much success because she trained really hard all winter. And then it just started to plateau and slow. And then as soon as it started going down, then she showed up here panicked. And we're it's really, there's nothing to panic about. It's as predictable as can be. And it's actually quite simple to resurrect, which also means it was quite simple to maintain. I think that's where his frustration was coming from. Man, if she only realized, but it's tough. They're managing so much at that time. But I was I think what we're really learning is that when we have someone for the very first year, off season into high school, it's kind of rare that they do it well. And I think we're doing our best to just keep educating, to keep holding their hand, figuratively speaking, as far as staying on them, even if they don't live here, of what's your week look like? Let me weigh in on what maybe you could do, just really being with them through that process. But I'm with you, Krista. I agree that our athletes who are returning year after year, they seem to be going in with a different mindset. I'm are you doing does your pregame warm up look like this? Are you throwing your plyos? Are you making sure you're not throwing live? They're yep. We've had athletes write us on Slack and say I woke up I pitched too much. The next day I didn't feel right. And so I told my coach, I cannot throw tomorrow. I'm whoa, and that's just from education. And I'm not advocating that it's when you're sore, go tell your coach you can't play. All of these scenarios are individualized. But what I thought is she's learned that through us. She's learned her own threshold. She's learned from previous pain, injury that this is a signal that I've got to put this fire out so it doesn't turn into something really bad for me. She knows that about herself. And so we didn't even, she didn't need us to come in and say and weigh in and say, here's what you should say. She already knew it. She already knew. And she was just telling us how she handled it. So that's cool to see. And I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves of that. It's a tough time. Some of our returning athletes are still obviously not able to handle it the best. But when they do, we just got to feel really good for them and about ourselves, and just keep moving along.
Even just sticking with the monitoring piece, the example that I've said this for multiple weeks now, we have a Division III college player who we saw her at the end of last season. She's a shortstop, played every game, just tons of reps, arm pain all season. The approach that they took was not great. It took a lot of stress, low intensity stress away from her, only could throw in games. And it led her to this cycle of basically no stress on her arm or her body to high stress. And we know the body's going to adapt to whatever the highest stress is. This year, because she has been through a full cycle with us, she trained all season, but reached a point towards the end of the season where she had some arm pain flare up and she panicked. It's the same concept. She panicked, but because she had kept up with our monitoring systems, we knew her movement quality, we knew her power, we had wellness questionnaires. We could very easily track it to, she had an extra couple of days off that she wasn't expecting and didn't throw low intensity plyos overhand, right? Didn't keep stress on her arm. And then the next time she went in, or next time she applied stress to her arm was a high intensity game, right? And so that spike we could easily track back. And so then we made a plan. It's like, okay, we're coming to my conference tournament time. You're going to have, all this extra time because classes are done. We've got to figure out how to keep stress applied to your body so that you don't experience these spikes. So I think the assumption in this transition, thinking of our team meeting yesterday, the assumption we're making in this transition between high school and travel ball is that athletes won't take a break, and that we want them to take a break, but we won't want them to take an entire break where they have no stress applied to their body. At least strength and conditioning, at least some low intensity work. It's sort of a backwards concept to think I've worked my butt off all season. I'm exhausted. I deserve a break. You absolutely do. But your body is going to have a stress applied to it in a few weeks that it is going to be unprepared for if you take everything off the table, right? If you have no strength and conditioning, no low intensity work, whether it's hitting or pitching, your body's not going to thank you for that. And it's going to lead to soreness, hopefully not injury, but pain, dysfunction. And that's the beginning of your travel ball season. And we're talking about Colorado at the end of June, right? Nationals in July. How's that going to play into how you're feeling over those first few weeks of your travel ball season? So it's like, you want to take a break, yes, but it's the right kind of break. It's not taking all those stressors out of your system, because this transition it's short but meaningful. And we don't want it to be completely void of any sort of stressors, because your body won't thank you in a couple of weeks for that.
You know what that made me think of? I was going to say, like, we always talk about how, like, even just nationally, the people that come here, contact us, find us it's like a lot of times. And I think this is starting to shift, and we're trying to keep pushing this. Are the people that, like, they've seen it go wrong.
Yeah.
They've either seen it go wrong from a recruiting standpoint, from a pain standpoint, from a just like, my performance isn't where I thought it would be. Like, it's like they have gone through the journey, they've gotten to a side of like, well, this isn't what we thought it was going to be. And so they're like, we need something else. And we always talk about, we want to make sure that we also can just keep putting our, like, education out there so that people don't feel like they have to kind of find themselves on the other side, like kind of disappointed or already in a tough situation and trying to resurrect it, but early on can do it. So for either younger athletes or like healthy athletes or athletes who are still on a good track, it doesn't mean that player development is not for you, and I think that's what made me think of that. It's just like, yes, our athletes who have been here for multiple seasons are like now realizing once it's not gone well, how to do it better. But what would be really powerful, and I think this is what we just like keep working to do, is for athletes to understand, like, you don't have to wait for that to happen.
That's right.
You really don't.
That's right.
And it's obviously better not to, but it's a hard thing. It's kind of like, if you think you're cruising, you think you're cruising.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to turn us here because I feel like we're not going to be short-winded with the answer to this question. So I'm going to kick it off so we can wrap up. So our question today is from Chris Malveaux, assistant coach, hitting coach at Tennessee. Good friend. Pretty good. Doozy, I think. So I'm going to play it, and then we will get our feedback here.
I don't know what this question is. I'm nervous.
It's a good one.
Okay.
And dealing with failure.
Oh, wait, hold on.
Obviously, this is a game of failure, especially on the offensive side. But, let's face it, if you play sports, you're going to fail at times. Do you see any type of movement forward and maybe, being at the youth level and dealing with failure, helping with perspectives, anything like that coming up?
The beginning that we were kind of talking over, he said, has there been an evolution, basically? So I think that, it's kind of like, have we seen any change or better ability, movement forward in a youth athlete's ability to fail? I was trying to think of what my answer to this is.
Dang it. That's a good question.
I know. Yeah. I think
I got an answer.
Yeah. Go
ahead. Okay. I was going to say, I think I'm like, OGX puts us in a little bit of a bubble. Yeah. Because, like, I don't think I can speak on if the youth environment as a whole is like learning to deal with this, because I don't know, as far as I'm concerned, it's like a wild circus out there, So I don't know if I'd show up at a travel ball tournament and be like, look at how healthy everyone's relationship is with failure. But I would say that in the OGX world,
you would not.
I would not, is my assumption, but I don't know. But in the world we live in, where families are really diving into and educating themselves on their athletes. I'll just talk about pitchers, but this is for hitters as well, and their data, and they're seeing their like roadmaps which we are laying out for them. Like the goal is that, like, yes, could she just throw this curve and screw at X amount of miles per hour right now and win this tournament this weekend or be successful this summer? Maybe. But like, that's not enough. These are the conversations we're always having. So what we really need to do is, like, she's not going to be able to rely on this drop ball this summer because she can't command it because she's never really thrown it. But her ticket to really having an opportunity at the level that you are saying she wants, then we've got to lean into this. And I do think because those are the conversations we have on the inside. And again, we're like, okay, but in order to get there, she's here. She's on step 2. And so that's sort of like step 6. And so, like, okay, the first thing we're going to measure is if she can do this. And if we can make this change and she's got a little better arm slot, then let's move into this. And so our roadmaps are about, we're measuring at an assessment, we're educating them on like what the ultimate goal is and why, because what scales at different levels, and then how do we slowly get there. So I do think that a lot of the conversations that, I would say the overwhelming majority of conversations that I have with families here at OGX are very understanding of the long path. And they might even be like, oh, she struggled this weekend. And we'll jump on a call or we'll talk and it's like, okay, well, here's why it seems like she struggled. This is what we've been going for. Here's kind of the disconnect of what the game is asking of her right now. And they're like, okay. And sometimes they need those conversations and reminders. But I do think in the OGX bubble, it's very long-term focused. And then people are more willing to accept the journey and the failures along the way. But my assumption, again, is that is a bubble. And that, it is very much, I assume, I like that I don't know this actually, that like, if pitchers that we don't work with at all, they struggle on the weekend, they're thinking like, I got to get into my lesson with, Mr. Such and Such on Tuesday to like fix that up real quick, I assume that's really still happening a lot, but in our world, it doesn't as much. And I'm proud of that.
That was actually going to be my initial answer, was like, as long as the lesson driven model of instruction, as long as that stays prevalent, and that we are not in this training model where we are asking athletes to work through failure from training and not trying to puppeteer them to perfection, as long as that lesson model just sticks around and is so pervasive at the youth level because it's a moneymaker, it feels like a quick fix, for whatever reason, we will have athletes that struggle with failure, because that's what that model really perpetuates, right? It is, I got to get in there for, half an hour, 45 minutes. And I understand that as the instructor, for what they're paying you for that half hour, 45 minutes, you want them to have a good result. That's natural human behavior. As a coach, you want them to come out of that lesson feeling great, because that's also your business model, right? Makes total sense. But every time that a kid is in a lesson like that, and we're talking about quick fixes, or you've got to just like, get them to throw the thing the right way, that language then tells them that like, okay, then I was doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's not this acceptance of like, no, you need to try and fail. And then we got to tap into, why does that expose something about you? What does that expose about you?
Or is that even realistic to expect from yourself right now?
Exactly.
Like, that's another thing.
Exactly.
Side note, Laura,
expectations.
I may have given you a jab when you used mayhem, but puppeteering to perfection, that was a good one.
Puppeteering to perfection. I did. That was last week's blog post too.
Okay.
So
yeah,
good one. Nice. Chain and perfection.
So I'm also coaching my son's 8U Little League. So I'm seeing some, also the side of that, which is similar.
It's a unique
youth
perspective.
Baseball and youth softball are similar. What I would say about both games, so from softball, is that what happens at the youth level, so lesson model definitely feeds into this, but also is that you have the athletes, I think about like our Little League team. There are kids right now who are just better, whether that's a size thing, whether it's because they've been exposed to baseball. It doesn't have anything to do with long-term better, but who are better in this moment. Those kids at Little League, and same for like 10U softball, they only have success. So they pitch harder than everyone or throw more strikes. And so they come in and all they do is strike everyone out. They are bigger, they are better hitting, and the other pitchers are not as good. So all they do is most of the time get hits and get on. And so right now, I think at the youth level, this is very similar for the conversations I have a lot of times with youth softball players, is that you are either above everyone. And so that's the majority of who leads our game. And those people have almost like a a wildly misconception of what success looks like, because the success rate is like, 90%, which is not real for the game. They're just so much above. Or we weed out the other kids because they're like, forget this. Like I can't play it. I can't do it. I'm having so much failure, which also their failure is even more. My ring light just died, so now I'm darker. Their failure is even more, like it's too much. It's too extreme. And so I think what is interesting is that the game, because it's so hard and we start it so early, is that it creates this misconception where a lot of times I think the reason people have struggles with failure is that they come to us at these transition years, 14U, when they're going into high school, when this first realization of like, this isn't normal. I'm not supposed to be this successful in this game. This isn't real. And they panic because of that, and they don't know how to fail it. So going back to even like, yes, I think 100% the lesson model feeds into this. But I think the way we structure the youth game, like that's the main contributor of this, which is we either lose people because their failure is so high at those ages. And so like it's a level that they shouldn't have to deal with. Like who the hell wants to play a game where every single time I come, I think that's probably what my son thinks right now, is like, this game stinks. All I do is strike out. He's just like littler and, he's just kind of developmentally behind the other kids. And so it's, you either don't want to play the game because you're like, this is a terrible game where I don't fail, I fail even higher at the rate than we're asking them to fail at the highest level. Or at the younger ages, they're like, I'm the freaking best at this game. Every day I get, I'm 4 for 4. I'm 3 for 4. I strike everyone out. I have 18 strikeouts. I have whatever. And then you hit the stage where that's not true and you don't know how to accept that because the game has sort of fed you a false reality. So my answer is no. I don't think anything has shifted in the game to have, I think yes, in the OGX walls, because this is something we really care about. And we put a lot of work on educating people, even those kids that we're talking about now as we get younger kids who are wildly successful, of really educating them on, yes, but let's also talk about how this is going to scale. And are you doing the work for this to scale to the next level? Don't just assume you're going to make the jump at the next level. So, we're doing so much work on that in the walls. I wish that OGX was a bigger percentage of our game, but, I don't think it is at the youth level. And so I think like 100%, nothing has changed in the game to make ability to fail better. I just don't think that's reality. Maybe the highest level of athlete at the very end stages, like I think about my team, they're facing a really hard competition in the summer. So maybe you get those kids who are like, they have to learn some adversity and really challenge themselves in the summer. So maybe that is helping, that we have these like really higher stages for those kids who are going on to the next level. But I don't think generally that the game is structured in any way, youth sports probably in general, but for softball, it's structured in any way that we would be building our resilience to failure. I don't see how that's happening. So
I had a conversation with a pitcher who lives remotely the other day, and she's experiencing some pain, and it's kind of significant. So she's going to shut down for a couple of weeks, put the fire out, and then build back up before the summer. And she was panicking. I mean, I was on this call. I just was like, what can I do in the meantime? Can I do things that are just, and the questions were like rapid fire. I felt her panic. She's a freshman in high school. But that's the mindset of a competitor. Time off feels catastrophic, no matter how much time off. From my perspective, I'm like, you're a freshman and it's 2 weeks. Like this will literally have, the only way this will have an impact on your career is if you don't just give yourself the 2 weeks,
Right.
But that's not how she thinks. So, and I recognize that. But what I found myself really talking to her about is like, what success in the game looks like is longevity in the game. If you have to longevity in the game is success. They are the same. There is no such thing as like a race. There is no such thing as like now matters more than anything else, because it doesn't matter what you hit velo wise. It doesn't matter, what level you get recruited at. If you burn out and or if you're hurt. So if you really think about it, would be a successful career if I could last all the way through. That means mentally, emotionally, and physically. And I'm not saying that means like you shouldn't push for performance. You push through performance along that journey without if you think that pushing performance is starting to now compromise the longevity piece. And then that's the time you have to stop and think like, am I on the right track? And I think I have this conversation, honestly, Krista, you're talking about your son, 8-year-old baseball, but like with my husband as well, when we talk about like if our son is only 5, if he's going to get involved in sports, because he's now just starting to like ask and be interested in like soccer, and I always had kind of talked the same way of like, if we have our kids end up choosing to participate in sports, of course that would thrill me just because of how much I think that you gain from having teammates and, just the experience, of course. But it's very important to me that we are always, as parents, prioritizing what I said to my husband. We actually had this conversation just a few weeks ago, was that when your kids are at these like really vulnerable ages, like high school level, these teenage years, and like early in college, it's where life feels really challenging for them and they don't quite know who they are. Those are the times where you want sports to be feeding them and feeding their soul. Like that's the time where sports matter most. So if you're doing anything from age 8 or 9 up until that point that might reduce their risk of wanting to play in that age range, to me, it's such a miss, because, keeping your kids, and there's other ways to do it, obviously other than just playing sports, but like, to me, those are the most crucial years for kids, to just feel like, I know who my identity is. I know who my people are. I know what matters to me. And I think of like, if that's the end goal and that's the mindset, then you have to really think what you're doing when you're at these earlier ages. So that's not a like, here's how to parent, because, that's
no, but the early sports, sports specialization that we know, every athlete goes, it's not just a softball thing, every athlete goes through, it forms so much of their, I won't even say athletic identity, just their identity, but that early sports specialization, when they identify, I am a softball player at age 10, right? That gets ingrained in them as part of their identity. And then when they are incapable of handling a loss of control for whatever reason, injury, whether it's, disappointment of not making a particular team or whatever, there are the coping mechanisms for who am I outside of this right now aren't there, right? They haven't had a chance to build those things. And I think sometimes we throw kids in, this is coming from a non-parent, but that we throw kids in a lot of different activities to help them, bridge their identity across not just sports. And that's great, but it still doesn't get to the root of like, who are you outside of these external things that you do? I think that's just such a challenging component of the youth game.
Krista, oh, sorry.
I was just of separating that solidification of their athletic identity so young, having a healthy attachment to the sport and physical activity in general, but not so much that it becomes everything about who they are. And that is a fine line to walk.
This is related to Laura. I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought you were done there, but
you haven't punched me yet. So
that's true. We're really winning here. Remember I think it was around COVID time, maybe right before COVID, I can't remember, but it was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And we asked our OGX athletes, like it was like a mental health, there were some things going on in the game and there were some losses in the game, that we just felt like we got to really check in with our athletes more so than we're doing. We had this like, come together community event for the athletes to feel free to talk about. And something that always stuck with me, I felt the need to like call my sister and talk to her because her kids were right at the age of like starting sports. But the kids commented on the fact that like when they performed well, then their parents praised them on social media. Like, I am so proud of Susie because she did XYZ. She worked so hard. But when they don't do well, because obviously it's a game of
their children,
then they don't post at all. And so there's this like, I'm sure their parents those are not the intentions, but it's almost like I am proud to show your accomplishments when the result was good, but not. That stuck with me. That came from the athletes. That really, really stuck with me. And I'm like, there's no way what their parents are probably thinking of like, it feels like they're proud. I mean, it's all like, it all makes sense, but
it's rewarding effort, not always rewarding just success.
Yeah. And I just like, I don't know, that was really a powerful thing for me. And like I said, it really stuck with me. I felt the need to like talk to my sister about it, who, has kids who are a little older than mine, just FYI, because I feel like a great example of how these kids were teenagers, but they really educated. So I sometimes think this conversation about like, do kids handle failure is it them? Or is it the adults around them that, maybe are like the barriers and the hurdles to them thinking, So anyway, that's
the adults. I think like two things that came to my mind. One is both a little bit more about like me parenting through this, but the Little League went from full coach pitch to this year full kid pitch with catchers, which is a ridiculous transition. So a lot to unpack there. And I am coaching, so I proposed that we did a hybrid, and most of the coaches agreed to that, and ones didn't. And just felt like the improvements for the kids are better if we just play straight up. So with that aside, there's arguments both ways, but the line he used sticks with me, which is, as coaches, we should be picking the players who are pitching and catching who are most engaged to help ensure that the games, are going smooth. And I thought, what the hell does that mean when they're engaged? Like, first of all, they're the pitcher and catcher. Of course, they're engaged. There's a ball coming at you as the catcher. So, I'm pretty sure you're engaged and you're pitching every pitch. So, you're engaged. What you mean is good. What you mean is the people who can do the job that's right in front of them. And unfortunately, at this level, that's like on my team of 13, 4 maybe that can do that consistently and replicate it over and over. And honestly, sometimes they can do that. And so what you are meaning is let's weed out at 8 the kids who can't do that at this stage. And so anyways, that sticks with me so much because I think it goes so much to this is the adults driving this. Every single kid on my team, they want to pitch. They don't care. They throw 16 balls over the fence and they're like, I did a great job. When's my next time up pitching? That's what's inherent in them. And so to the extent that they don't feel that 100% comes from the situations we're putting them in or the adults around them or whatever it is. So I think that is very clear. I will say it's hard.
Is it engaged or is it they listen and march to orders? I think.
Yeah, well, it's just that they can do it.
Also, no 8-year-old is engaged in baseball.
Right? It's a snooze. They dig holes and spin in circles. Yeah.
And eyeballs that slide in the background, probably.
But I think one of the things I always think of as for myself is that it is hard. I'm around a really high level of sport all the time in my job. And so it is hard to go watch 8U soccer and to see my son looking backwards or not going for it and being aggressive. It is hard because you're just good try, And so all I will say to parents is all you can ask of yourself is to be self-aware of that, not to be perfect. That's not reality, not to be perfect. One of the things I recently had to do is my youngest and my oldest, they play soccer at the same time during the weekend. So a lot of times my husband and I have to split who's going where. And the youngest soccer is so made up that it's hard to feel anything. It's just they're running and God knows what's happening. It's a mob of people. And so right now I've asked my husband, I choose to go with my younger son because I don't want to come across as, aggressive with my older son. Right now he thinks it's fun and he's engaging in the sport. And whether that's in the way that I think he should be, I think that there's a level for myself where I'm I gotta take that judgment off of this. That's not appropriate for this right now. And so the only way right now I can it's not I'd never want to go to his games, but right now when the choice is this game or this game, for the health of all of us, I feel it's better for me to go to the younger son right now. And just, I think that there's a level of just, you can't expect yourself as an adult to be perfect because we're adults. We have adult perspectives of these things. And, your perspective in that moment might be you have to pay attention better, or you have to do these things or whatever. And so I think all you can ask for yourself, if we're trying to make more resilient kids who have identities outside the sport, who know how to fail, who don't value themselves based on recognition, which is a key to resiliency, that they can do all of these things, then we have to just keep asking ourselves as adults to be self-aware of maybe when we've fed into, that ultimate story, both in the system we've created, in the way that we parent, in the way that we coach, whenever we're feeding into that, I think you just have to just keep reflecting. You're not going to be perfect at it. That's you're not asking your kid to be perfect, right? The way that they're going to gain resilience is not through perfection. So I think you're never going to be perfect at it. But I think the more we can have more self-aware adults through this process, then the better, this process will be. So that I think is all you can ask of yourself. But I guess to answer your question, Chris, no. I just
long-winded.
Hopefully systems like OGX will keep filtering in, and I obviously we're not the only people like this in youth sports. So I think the more that we can be having these conversations and trying to make the game feed a little bit more of an environment that could possibly breed this level of resilience, then I think the better. But yeah, tough one. So. All right. Yeah, good conversation. This is our longest one, which I knew. I saw the time ticking, and I knew that we were going to answer long-winded on this question because it was a good one. But all right, next week we will be, probably starting, right? Super start on Thursday usually. So next week we'll be recording on first day we'll have a lot more information about how the postseason's going. So excited to chat on that. And excited to talk about whatever else comes up this week in the game. So subscribe, follow us, share the episodes, all of that helps. And then until next week.